Homesteaders, we need to stand up. We need to stand up for our rights to farm, to grow healthy food, and to get back to a simple way of life. And for some, that right is threatened all across the United States. Dear friends of ours, Kenny and Courtney over at Life on Beagle Road are fighting that fight right now. And so this is in support of the initiative that they're going through to maintain the right to farm their family's property. And so Kenny asked if we would take part in just some Q&A and some recommendations for our viewers on how you guys can get engaged and stay a part of this homestead movement. So one of his questions was, have we, Todd and I, ever been faced with any challenges from our local government? And fortunately, we can say no. But just because we haven't doesn't mean that that fight might not someday come to our door. So we need to be prepared. And then his second question was, are we aware of any township limits on homesteaders in the area? And I would say, yes, Kenny, I'm very aware. There's a 230-page ordinance book that I read before we even purchased this property. Yes, there are limits. What I would say is we're in a very, very fortunate area. We're in a rural agricultural area that any limitations on what it is that we do here on our property by no means inhibit us or limit our desires for what we want to do. In follow-up to that, if there were limits, what would we do to fight and make a change? I haven't had to fight for any changes, so that leads me into my recommendations. How can I and how can you get more engaged in the promotion of the homestead agenda, the rights and the freedoms that we as our ancestors and our forefathers did on this great land have the right to farm, to grow food within and for our local communities. So from a recommendation standpoint, just first, why is it important? This is a significant issue all across the United States. We have friends had to or have chosen to make the decision to leave their home and go and find a place that they can, with freedom, live out their homestead goals, whether it's raising their own food, living off grid, not being under the pressure of regulations and certain governmental ordinances that would otherwise inhibit them. I also know people, though, that have chosen to stay and fight, like Courtney and Kenny, that are adamant that their rights are not fair, that they're outside the bounds of any common sense. And I applaud them as well. So every person, either dreaming or in a current situation, is going to have to make those decisions for themselves. But I have some basic ideas of what we went through when we were just starting out on the homestead journey, and then what I would recommend for others to do. Number one, first and foremost, is get educated. Education is the basis for any change movement, any kind of power, any kind of ability to move the needle, whether it's in the political realm or anywhere else. You have to be educated first. So what do I mean by that? Don't go in to homesteading, into a land, into a situation, uneducated or blind by any means regarding what the laws are in your area. And what does that mean? So when you have to think about what you're allowed to do, unfortunately, in so many areas, there are 3 levels of laws basically you have to look at. You have to look at the zoning and ordinances within your township. You need to then expand that and say, okay, what are the laws and regulations and ordinances for my county that I live in? then you need to expand that and say, okay, what does the state say I can and cannot do? And that's challenging for somebody that would just like the freedom to just go about and do what they would like to do. The second part of educating yourself that I would recommend is research just common pitfalls and common challenges that other homesteaders have had. Whether it's the ability to have animals or the ability that you have to have animals contained. Maybe it's that you can't have a certain breed of an animal because they're considered invasive or potentially damaging to the environment. So I would recommend researching. And where to research? You can research your newspaper articles. There are likely recent petitions in the area. There could be YouTube videos that you can go and watch. And the last thing that I would recommend when it comes to educating yourself, and this is especially important for people that haven't purchased a property yet, but even if you own a property, things change. So number one, know how your property is zoned. But it doesn't start there. Once you know how your property is zoned, you need to research all the ordinances that apply to your specific zoning within the specific limitations that they set. So for example, we're zoned agriculturally. That sounds amazing, right? But we don't have the 10 plus acres or the title of a farm. So just because we're zoned agriculturally does not mean that we have free limits on how many animals we have on the property and what we can use the property for. We're not titled a farm, so therefore, and because we have less than 10 acres, we do have limits on the amount of animals that we can have on the property, the types of structures we can put on the property. So I need to be well informed and stay informed. And for example, one of our ordinances just changed, and had I not gone in and got up to date on the recent minutes from the zoning ordinance board meeting, I would have assumed I was under previous ordinances as they were written. So definitely stay informed, stay up to date. The second thing I'm going to recommend is that once you're educated, start educating others. Any social media outlet is a wonderful place to get a common message out there. That's likely what I'm going to recommend is that you stick with a common theme to your messages, that it's not all over the place, but stick to an agenda. You know, in my corporate environment, we always call those elevator speeches. Know what your speech is and what it is you're trying to communicate and get your message out there. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your local community. If you know that something's going to go before your local zoning board that would go against what it is that you're trying to promote, get your neighborhood and your community and start communicating that. Maybe send letters out. So there's lots of things. And that leads me into the third thing that you can do, and that is get engaged. So how can you get engaged? The way that I know I'm not engaged enough, that I need to get engaged, is I need to participate more in my local government. I need to go to the zoning board meetings. So get engaged in your local government as much as you can. Get engaged in your farmers markets. Share with them maybe and discuss what the local challenges are in their communities that they live in, because a lot of us, especially in the county that we live in, we don't live in the same townships. And lastly, and this is a big one, I'm going to encourage everyone to come up with what it is that you want to communicate and write to your local and state level and then federal level government officials. Write to them why this freedom is being infringed upon, and know your facts first. I can't recommend that enough. Research the history of your area. Research the history of how our freedoms have been imposed on, and likely from an industrial perspective rather than just understanding that there's a movement that people just want to have the right to grow their own food. And unfortunately, the government thinks that they need to regulate that. So they're applying these industrial regulation principles on just local backyard farms. And I think they've just taken it to the extreme rather than being willing to let's have a conversation here. That's the only way that we're going to make a change together as a community. We have to be educated and we have to be willing to communicate. Silence leads to nothing. Silence has never affected a change. So at last, I would just encourage you, if you feel compelled, make your own video as a way to communicate. Why should homesteaders take a stand? And in what ways would you recommend others take a stand to get this movement more visible, more heard, the message more broadly widespread? So come along with me, supporting life on Beagle Road, supporting other farmers that are currently finding themselves under judgment by their local legislation. And let's support them by just getting the message out there that we should have the right to farm.